Well, good morning. Welcome back to the Broadcast Retirement Network. I'm Jeff Snyder. This is BRN Sunday for Sunday, June 13th, 2021. We've got another great show for you today. We're going to be talking to members of the media, academia, and financial services as we analyze all the news this week in retirement markets, technology, personal finance, so much more. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this episode of BRN Sunday. Well, let's kick things off with a look at personal finance. And joining us on the line, she is personal finance reporter for The Motley Fool, Ms. Mari Backman. Mari, so great to talk to you. Thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jeff.
And look, a lot of things in America are reopening. People are thinking about going on vacation. We're post Memorial Day, so vacation, typically a vacation time, people get out on the road. But still, there's a lot of things that we need to learn from the pandemic, and I know you wanted to talk about what you call the good old emergency fund. What can you tell us?
I do want to talk about that because, it's not the most exciting thing, and it's not the most, fun way to kind of spend your money. I mean, you're not spending your money, you're saving your money, but, right now everyone's really excited because things seem to be a lot better with regard to the pandemic, and states are, lifting different, travel mandates and quarantine mandates, and, people are, and jobs are getting added, and it's totally okay to be optimistic. But, I think we can't lose sight of the fact that, first of all, we're not out of the woods with regard to the pandemic. It's not over. And there's still a large chunk of the U.S. population that's not vaccinated, and we don't know how that's going to impact things. But, I think we need to also ground ourselves a little, right? A lot of us now, we're kind of reworking our budgets and saying, okay, I'm going to carve out money to travel. I'm going to be spending more money on restaurants and this and that. But, just 15 months ago, we basically had, we went from having a, decent level of available jobs to the U.S. economy shedding, millions of jobs by the week. Mm-hmm. So the pandemic taught a lot of people the hard way that if you don't have money in the bank for emergencies, you're really putting yourself at risk of a whole world of trouble. Thankfully, because, the pandemic was so extreme, there were these provisions and protections that were put into place. So, for example, like there were the eviction bans, and there was forbearance for mortgage borrowers so that homeowners who suddenly couldn't pay their mortgages didn't risk losing their homes to foreclosure, and all these programs that were put into place. And obviously that spared a lot of people a world of financial pain. But the thing is, we don't know what the next big crisis is going to be, and we don't know what protections and what relief is going to be available. So I think at this point in time, Jeff, while people are maybe getting a little bit more just secure in terms of where we're at with the pandemic, they're getting a little more secure with their own finances, they're spending a little more freely, they're upping their vacation budgets. I think it's important to take a look at the good old savings account and say, okay, what do my savings look like? Because as a general rule, I like to tell people that it's important to have enough money in a savings account to pay for at least 3 months of living expenses. And that's really kind of your minimum. So I would say that if you're not there yet, while you're carving out all that extra money for vacations and whatnot, well, you might want to spend a little more conservatively and put some of that money into the bank.
Yeah, and I want to take you back pre-pandemic, January of 2020. This is from Bankrate, which does a lot of this polling. I'm sure you and the folks at The Fool covered this as well. 41% of Americans, so this is out of 1,000 people that they statistically, I guess, poll. 41% of Americans, Mari, would be able to cover a $1,000 emergency. That's 41%. What about the other 59%, Mari? And so you're right, being a good steward of your own personal finances, but before you go out there and try to run your credit card or expend money, let's get back to brass tacks here and the right tactics for the long term.
Right. And look, I do actually, since you brought it up, I do want
Oh,
to
it's my
comment
fault.
on
It's my
surveys
fault.
like that.
It's my fault.
It's your fault. So once in a while, you'll get like Federal Reserve data on, the number of people who could cover an emergency that costs X dollars, right? Whether they do a, 500, 1,000, whatever it is, and that data tends to be a little bit more broad-based. I have to be honest in that I don't put a lot of stock into a survey that's based on 1,000 people when we consider how many hundreds of millions of, U.S. adults we have. So, 1,000 people is hardly a representative, subset of the population. I do think that there are a lot of people out there who don't have emergency savings or who don't have adequate emergency savings. And, whether or not the percentage is actually, 59% who couldn't cover a $1,000 expense or a different number, the point is, we know that there are people like that out there. And, the percentage doesn't necessarily matter as much. I think it's really, a lot of times, like I see these surveys, right, and it uses this arbitrary figure. It uses $500 or $1,000 or whatnot, and so I have a little bit of a problem with that because it's a little misleading because it sort of seems to, even though it's not saying this directly, it sort of seems to send a message, right, that, oh, well, all right, I have $1,000 in savings, so I'm good, because I'm in the 41% of people who could cover a $1,000 emergency. But hold on a second, because, let's say that it normally costs you $4,000 a month to pay your mortgage, put food on the table, make your car payment, and all of your bills, and you lose your job, and it takes a while for your unemployment claim to kick in, and you have no money coming in. Suddenly $1,000 is not going to cut it. So that's why, I like to say, Jeff, instead of thinking of like an arbitrary savings target, my emergency fund should have $1,000. It should have $3,000. It should have $5,000. Instead of that, I like to say 3 months at a minimum of your living expenses, whatever your living expenses amount to. Because one guy might spend $2,000 a month, another guy might spend $8,000 a month. So it's really got to be a personal calculation there.
Yeah, and by the way, I wanted to bring it up from a principal point of view. I agree with you, and we need to do a show either here on the podcast or on the network about some of these samples because it's not just this polling, because it's not just polling in our line of work, it's polling everywhere. So we're gonna put that aside. That's a great idea, and we need to do that. But I think from a principal point of view, I was just trying to get at that. Most of us don't really think about what we need to save, and I agree with you 100%. Let's not think about it in terms of pure dollars because you're right. What I spend, I don't have a family like you do, so I have a wife and 2 cats. Very different spending probably than you and your family when you have 2 children. You have children. So,
right.
So I really point well taken.
Right. No, exactly. And I do think that's important because, I know people who, and I've had this conversation with friends and people who say, oh, yeah, I'm good. I'm solid. I have $10,000 in savings. I have $15,000 in savings. And I'm like, but you live in an expensive part of the country, and I bet your monthly mortgage and property tax alone is $3,000. So you probably spend $8,000 to $10,000 a month. So if you have $10,000 in savings, that sounds like a really nice, impressive number, except that's really only going to get you through about a month if you were to lose your job. And look, to be fair, I mean, I'm not saying that if you sock away that 3 months worth of living expenses that you won't run into trouble either. I mean, if you happen to lose your job, let's say, and it takes you 8 months to find another one, well, all right, that's not a great situation to be in because unemployment income doesn't pay very much, and if you're someone earning $100,000 a year and all of a sudden you're out of work for 8 months, you might blow through your savings pretty quickly because unemployment is not going to cover a very large chunk of your former paycheck. So, my advice is it's not a guarantee, but, at the same time, I think there's only so much money that we can expect people to, A, save, and B, keep in a savings account given the way interest rates are trending today. I mean, they're abysmal. You'll get maybe like half of 1% interest, so 0.5, percent interest, which is, I mean, it's peanuts, So I can't really tell people, oh, well, go ahead, save 10 months worth of living expenses, and yeah, just keep that in a savings account where you'll make no money. I don't think that's very good advice either, but I like to tell people 3 months worth of bills is the minimum, but it's better to aim for 6 months worth if you can. And I will just come out and say it that I personally have an emergency fund that covers even more months than that of living expenses. I like to save between 9 and 12 months of living expenses, even though that causes me to basically make nothing on some of my money while it's in a savings account. I have my reasons for that. Jeff, as you know, I'm self-employed, and normally I would not be entitled to unemployment income if something were to happen to my job. Right now, self-employed people are eligible for some benefits because of the pandemic, but that's not a normal thing. So for me, I have to be a little bit extra careful. I also have 3 kids. I have an animal at home. My household has 2 cars. We have a house where something seems to break every month. So I personally take a more conservative and cautious approach there. I don't necessarily know or think that the average person needs to have like 9, 10 months worth of bills in the bank. But I think that 3 months is the minimum, and I think 6 months is an even better target to aim for.
Wow, very well said. Mari Backman, always a pleasure chatting with you. Mari, I want to plant a seed, and I don't know if you take requests in terms of stories, but I'd love to talk about the mental health aspect of finance, because I think it's all something, given what's happening today, the return to work, the return to school, and just the return to kind of normalcy, that's got to drain you mentally as well. I know you're not a qualified psychologist or psychiatrist, but maybe that's something that you might tackle in the future. We're going to leave it there. Mari, always a pleasure chatting with you. Thanks for coming on the program, and look forward to having you back again very soon.
Sounds good.
Thanks. Bye-bye. Welcome back. Time to talk a little technology and consumer products. And joining us on the line, he is lead advisor, executive producer for 7 Investing. Let's welcome back to the program, Daniel Klein. Dan, so great to talk to you. Thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Good morning, Jeff. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to talk to you as always. 2 stories that really percolated both of our interests. The first is tech is really shaking up the supermarket. And, Dan, given what's happening with gas prices, but also the prices of goods, this might be a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I order groceries quite a bit. And it's important to remember that right now, this is a very, very manual process. And that makes absolutely no sense. This could be fully automated. 2 years ago, maybe even 2.5 years ago, I saw technology that was in the 5 figures, so not even all that expensive, that would allow grocery stores to automate the picking process. So if something took 10 people, maybe now it would take 1 person. But at the moment, this is very, very manual.
And that creates opportunity, Dan. Throughout history, if you can do things better, if you have a manual process and do things better, that's going to electronically or digitally, or, we all remember the fax machine, how that really improves business. And I think, organizations like, Instacart, the one that you're always talking about, Instacart, Amazon Prime, etc. I mean, they are really leading the way in terms of how we interact with our grocery shopping. I still like to go into the store, and I see a lot of Whole Foods purchasers or people that are shopping on behalf of people. So I don't see this going away post-pandemic.
No, and it's important to remember, this is less than 10% of the market, but I think it has the potential to become significantly more. So I have to admit, I am a lazy person in that I work a lot. So I have ordered Whole Foods, even though I can almost see Whole Foods from my door. It's less than a mile from my house. They must feel I'm ridiculous when I order, but it's a $35 minimum. So I was going to make salmon the other night. I ordered 4 items from Whole Foods delivered. It's unbelievably convenient, but a human being has to literally go and pick my order. That doesn't make sense. You're going to see technology where you pick a Whole Foods or you pick a Walmart or whatever it is that's maybe not in the most densely populated area, and that might serve as the tech hub for 3 or 4 of those locations, and they'll have an automated backend. Or you might even see some of these stores give up some floor space to put in this type of automation.
Yeah. And Dan, this type of automation, I'm just trying to think it through in terms of the price increases we've seen. Um, by increasing automation, that eliminates a certain level of cost. Do you think that people can pass that on in terms of the prices of goods, meaning people, meaning the organizations, that the supermarkets, right? Do you think that that can help lower some of the costs of some of these goods like milk and butter and
So,
eggs
so
and fish, et
it's
cetera?
not it's not going to lower the cost of milk or butter or eggs, but it's going to lower the additional cost you pay for delivery. One of the dirty secrets about Instacart, and they tell you this, but they're not screaming it from the rooftops, is that when you order from Instacart, every item you buy costs more than what you pay in the grocery store. So not only are you paying an annual fee, not only are in some cases you paying a delivery fee, you're also paying, somewhere between say 5 and 20% more for every item. And I'm making that up because they don't fully disclose how
Right.
much extra you're paying, but you're absolutely paying more money for each item. So if you automate it, if you take the hundreds of thousands of people that between Instacart and Walmart are physically picking orders, if you take them out of it, then yes, there should be more room for them to make money and you to actually not pay that big an increase.
Mm. Dan, let's shift gears. One of the great things about this segment is we can talk about a lot of different things, whether it's consumer goods, technology. There's a little spat going on, or a big spat, between Facebook and Apple about creator revenue earned off of creators. So those would be people like us who are creating content every day, and there's usually revenue sharing that exists with some of these platforms. YouTube comes to mind, Flipboard, others, right? And Facebook, I guess, recently announced that they are not going to take a cut of revenue from creators who make money on their platforms until 2023. So that's created a little bit of a spat with our friends at Apple, or maybe they're not my friends, but you're probably your friends at Apple. So I'm just being facetious and sarcastic, of course. But what can you tell us there? I mean, how does this all kind of shake out in terms of people who generate content, make money, and the proliferation of that?
So overall, people don't love that Apple takes 30%. That's pretty much non-negotiable. So it is a very smart public relations play for Facebook to say, okay, we're going to take nothing. So that is very much taking this company that, I don't know, I'm going to say most people view Facebook as pretty evil. And it puts a positive spin on it.
Yeah.
But here's the reality. Yes, Facebook might be a nice additional channel for these things. It's not going to replace Apple. So this isn't really about sticking it to Apple. It's more about, okay, let's give Facebook a platform. Let's try to get some of these people on Facebook, and then we'll take 5%, 10%, whatever the number is, when they eventually take some revenue. So yeah, is Facebook making a populist play? Absolutely, they are. But long term, is that really a game changer? I don't think it is. Look, Facebook has been really good for small business. For all the terrible things Facebook does with data, they've done some really nice things with small business. So I do think this is good for Facebook. Do I think Apple will even notice that anything happened here? No, I don't think this will be meaningful for Apple in any way.
Uh, So what does this mean? And you just the comment you made about the 30%, and I know YouTube is really. Let's talk about creation, content creation for a couple minutes, because we've seen companies like YouTube really minimize or diminish the revenue cut that they're paying to creators. And I should add that this show does not receive any revenue from YouTube, even though we do post our content there just as a storing spot. But what does that mean in terms of the content creation marketplace? Are you seeing more platforms pop up, things that are a little bit more equitable in terms of the people that are actually creating content that we view? And by the way, Dan, I tend to view more YouTube created content by creators than I do even Netflix or Prime or
Yeah, I mean,
HBO
look,
Max. Sorry.
I think the platforms have the power. So, do I think there'll be slight concessions to talent? And certainly, if you're a powerful creator with a big audience, might you get better terms? Possibly. But we're on YouTube as well, and it's not a major platform for us. We do a lot better as a podcast than we do as a video show or as a live show than we do as a recorded show. But that being said, I do think you need YouTube. You need these platforms. So I don't expect much better terms for creators. I think
Hmm.
there'll be slight changes and maybe some slightly more friendly terms. But for the most part, you need these platforms, and I'm not so sure that the Apple 70/30 model is all that unfair. Like they're taking your content and making it available to hundreds of millions of people.
Hmm.
I kind of feel like 30% is not a crazy unfair amount for them to ask for.
No, I think, typically I just know from my own negotiations that on some of these larger streaming platforms, it's a 50-50 rev share split on advertising. That is typical. I'm talking about big, big, big platforms.
Yeah, that tends to be on content platforms
Yeah.
where you're competing with, the real major players. So like that might be, and I'm not speaking out of school, but I want to say, a typical MSN deal might be like 60/40 in favor of the
Hmm.
creator. It depends. If somebody's bringing you audience that you wouldn't have had otherwise, I actually think it's worth paying that money. If I knew I could get an extra 20,000 people watching my show and I had to pay 50/50 on the revenue, I would take that, 100 times over.
Yeah. Dan, I want to go back to one last point, then we can, I think you can go back to doing all the great work that you're doing. You mentioned the Facebook trying to, or Facebook, excuse me. Boy, that shows how old school I am. You mentioned Facebook trying to kind of relaunch its image, and you made the comment that many people kind of perceive them as evil, and some of that is rightly earned. Do you see them over time kind of rehabilitating their image and putting policies in place, or is it just really that it's like an annuity? What is an annuity? And there's a lot of negative connotations around annuities, and it's a completely different animal, but annuities have really improved over the last 10 or 20 years. They're very different than what they were, but there's an exercise in kind of educating the marketplace about an annuity. Does that same thing hold true for rehabilitating an image of a Facebook or a Twitter or some of these other platforms that maybe have a negative perception in people's
Well,
minds?
I think Facebook has a negative perception because of what they do with your data. Jeff,
Yeah.
if you and I talk about buying a couch, we start seeing couch ads on Facebook.
Yeah.
That's inherently evil. Like if I haven't actually input something into their system, they shouldn't know it. Whereas Twitter, it's more the users that are a problem. Like are there trolls on Twitter? Is there a lot of disinformation on Twitter? Absolutely. Could they be doing more to police that? Sure. But for the most part, as someone who's in the FinTwit world,
FinTwit. Okay.
99% of my Twitter interactions are positive and upbeat. And I'm sure that's not true if you're, say, like a female celebrity. But as someone who's posting long-term investing advice, the vast majority of my Twitter conversations are good. So I feel pretty good about Twitter. I don't feel great about Facebook. But the reality is, if I want to share a picture of my cats with all my relatives, I have to put it on Facebook. So do I think Facebook could do a better job? Yes. Do I think they will? No, absolutely not. Their model makes money, and I'm not sure we're going to see any sort of big changes away from that.
Yeah. Well, really interesting conversation, Dan. Really thank you again for joining us on the program. Appreciate you coming on every week and kind of helping us understand the lay of the land. Have a great rest of the week, and we'll talk to you again next week.
I need a cup of coffee. I'll see you next week,
Go
Jeff.
for it, Dan. Bye bye. Welcome back, and now we're going to chat about real estate. Joining us on the line, he is MarketWatch's real estate reporter. Jacob Passy joined us on the line this morning. Jacob, thanks so much for joining us on the program this morning.
I am so glad to be here.
Yeah, it's great to always chat with you about the ever-evolving, ever-changing world of residential real estate and also commercial real estate. I know this week you wanted to talk about the big I, and I'm not talking about interest rates. I'm talking about inflation. What's top of mind when it comes to inflation?
Yeah, so this week the Consumer Price Index came out, so there's been lots of talk about inflation. We are seeing, kind of record levels of inflation almost. The Consumer Price Index overall reached a 13-year high for May. So that was, that's starting to stoke a lot of conversations about whether the Federal Reserve will change their policy, how are consumers dealing with all of this. I mean, you're seeing prices rise for all sorts of things. Interestingly, and the focus I took, because I write about real estate, obviously, is looking at how housing factors into all of this. So housing is weighted very heavily in the consumer price index, which is not, to be fair, it's not the main source of, inflation data that the Federal Reserve looks at, but it's, a really, useful tool to gauge, how much prices are rising and, all the issues that come with that. So housing is weighted heavily, makes sense. Probably one of the largest expenditures per month for a family is, rent or the mortgage. And so it's about a third of the overall increase in inflation in May was attributed to rising housing costs. But interestingly, when you dig down to the percent changes and stuff like that the CPI teased out, it might sound weird. So basically, the government statisticians who put together the CPI said that housing costs, housing prices, which is both for owner occupants and for renters, increased 2.2% over the past year. But that probably sounds really low, especially to people who've been listening to this program, because you and I have talked about how home prices are rising upwards of 10% a year. The most recent Case-Shiller index for March showed that home prices had risen by more than 13% over the past year. Mm-hmm. So why is there this discrepancy? What does that all mean? And it's a complicated problem. This might be one of the most complicated stories I've had to write about the real estate market, because inflation is kind of a weird concept when it comes to housing. So when economists are measuring inflation for normal things, it's a little easier. They're looking for consumer goods, but they include housing because that is, maybe it's not the same, kind of function as like buying a new T-shirt or food or what have you, but it's something that households spend a significant amount of their monthly income on. So they want to include it. It's an important thing to include. It's a major driver of GDP, of the economy, et cetera. But this is where it gets complicated for the CPI's purposes. To economists, especially if you own your own home, that is also a capital good. It is an investment. It's like a stock. You're getting, you're growing your wealth by owning a home because the property value goes up over the time. You can cash in on that. So it's not like buying a banana. It's different from that in certain ways, but also not in other ways. And to, the average person, well, yes, it is a capital good, but, if home prices are going up and you're a home buyer, that means you're going to have a higher cost of living. So it's a complicated issue. Some of the discrepancy between the two measures come down to how it's all reported out. So, the Case-Shiller index is based on actual data from home sales. They are looking at the sales prices registered at local registry offices on the deed, and they use that data to gauge the trend over time. And they specifically look for homes, existing home sales. So they're not looking at new home sales. They're looking at homes that have been bought once and then bought again, and then they're measuring the change over time. So that's different from CPI. To produce the housing costs for the CPI, the statisticians actually use a survey. So they're actually surveying Americans. For renters, it's easy. They're just asking what your rent is. It gets a little more complicated, again, for home owners, because you're not paying the rent. Maybe you have a mortgage, so you kind of know how much that costs. But, a lot of people, have paid off their mortgage. Maybe they bought all in cash. So if you're still trying to gauge inflation in home prices, that gets difficult. So what they ask homeowners to tell them is the owner's equivalent rent. So basically how much a homeowner thinks they could rent their home for if they were to decide to rent it and be a landlord, essentially. Mm-hmm. There are issues with this. It's survey data. It's wonky. It's, maybe people aren't great about responding, and it's also slow. So that was one of the big things I learned is, for someone, let's say a renter signed a lease in March, well, between March and May, their rent hasn't gone up. It's going to be the same for the next year probably, or 2 years, however long. So change the way that they measure it, since they're doing it on surveys and trying to figure out how much people are actually spending each month on their housing, that's slow to change because it only changes when you move, basically, or maybe when you sign a new lease, or if you have an adjustable rate mortgage, your home costs could go up or down depending on, how your interest rate on your mortgage changes. So this is all complicated, but this is all to say that, when the problem that we might have now is that the government may be underestimating how much inflation there really is in the housing market. Because of these lags in time, the record-breaking price appreciation that we see in reports like Case-Shiller may not really fully appear in their full-fledged form in the CPI data and other, inflation data that the Federal Reserve most closely looks at for, another year or so, because it's going to be a while before, enough people in these surveys they do kind of reflect those rising prices. The other issue is COVID has thrown off how we measure things as well. When it comes to people moving over the past year, you and I have talked a lot about this.
Yep.
But Americans have been, moving out of cities, buying homes in the suburbs. And for a lot of those families, they may have traded a higher rent for a lower mortgage payment. There is Zillow had a great report this week as well, talking about how the trend in the past year was that Americans were buying bigger homes, but the homes were actually cheaper because they were moving further and further out from the expensive city centers because they didn't have to worry about commuting to work when they were working remotely. So that throws everything for a loop because we kind of know, economists I spoke to, you know that home prices are going up. But if the people who are buying homes right now are largely buying homes that were cheaper than the home they were already in, it kind of makes it look like home prices are going down. So it's very complicated, and it has real ramifications for policy and things like that because, the Federal Reserve may start shifting their interest rate policy to account for inflation eventually, and that will have an effect on how much a mortgage costs. And when we talk about, it's hard to build homes right now because all the materials that go into a home, the lumber, the steel, et cetera, are all really expensive. And really the main solution for inflation in the housing market, if we start seeing the housing market overheat, to some extent, prices could fall, but you don't want that, is we need more supply. Ultimately, the reason we are seeing inflation in the housing market is because there is not enough supply of homes for renters or owners, really. So it's a really complicated subject, really complicated issue, but I thought it was interesting. I think it's good to learn and understand how, the economists and policymakers are thinking about a problem because that sometimes is different from how you are experiencing it in your everyday life.
Yeah, really good points there, Jacob. Let me ask you, is there I actually had the pleasure of speaking with the chief economist of the National Association of Realtors earlier in the week, learning we kind of looked back at some April home data. Where have you gotten any more detail or data around, for example, I would assume that one of the things that is baked into the inflation cost, at least in new homes, is lumber, piping, some of these commodities, these things that are needed in order to build new homes. That probably has a big chunk of this housing cost inflation. Any word on whether or not the market is the supply chain is kind of easing a little bit, and we're seeing more lumber be created? Or are we still kind of looking at maybe down throughout the summer and into the early autumn for a recovery, potential recovery? I should say.
These are great. No, that's a great question, and I before I answer it directly, I also want to add, because you raised a great point. I think that lumber prices are going up, and they're a good example of how not all price increases are actually inflation. So in the case of lumber, it is.
Oh, I think you may have muted yourself, Jacob.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. No worries.
So,
you left us with bated breath on the answer to the question, or one of the questions. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yes. So, it's a great question. And, first off, I want to add, when we look at something like lumber, it is important to remember that not all price increases are inflation. Rising prices is not exactly equal to inflation. And I say that because lumber is a good example. Airfares are a great example. Used cars are a great example. A lot of the increases we're seeing in prices right now in the economy, throughout the economy, are a reflection of supply chain issues. So with lumber, mills were not producing enough wood to keep up with demand, in part because they actually ramped down their operations this time last year because the pandemic was reaching a fever pitch, and they figured there's not going to be much home sales for the next year or two, so might as well stop producing the wood for homes. Well, things changed very quickly, and soon enough we saw, millions of people across the country wanting to move into new homes. They couldn't have foreseen that, and so that is contributing to the rising costs. Eventually, those lumber prices will come back down to earth. We're starting to see that. We're starting to see lumber prices retreat from the really, at one point they were up something like 300% year over year, really crazy.
Wow.
They're coming down from that, which is good. I mean, that's certainly a good thing. But, it's going to take time. And even if lumber prices get back to normal, and steel prices are also, coming down. I mean, there are also issues related to tariffs to consider. So, the home building industry is very frustrated that the Biden administration has continued a lot of the tariff policies from the Trump administration that they said were making it harder for their industries because it's more expensive to import, steel from overseas, import lumber from Canada because of these tariffs. So they're hoping that those will be erased, and it remains to be seen whether the Biden administration will do that or not. But that's something to look out for. And then, in the longer term, there are, the construction industry is going to have other issues that will keep the pace of home construction slower than where we need it to be. One big issue is labor. There's not enough skilled labor, they argue, to go around. I mean, you need to kind of, not just anyone can walk onto a construction lot and know what to do.
Yep.
So you need workers who know the tools of the trade, literally. From that perspective, the cost of labor, the shortage of labor is going to slow things down. Land is still really expensive and harder to come by. And another issue with that is zoning. So, the Biden administration, Republicans, kind of people on both sides of the aisle are hoping to see zoning restrictions relaxed, but those are done at the local level. And so it's up to local politicians to do that. And sometimes they come up against really stringent opposition from neighbors who don't want a lot of construction in their communities, and the whole not in my backyard kind of attitude. So that slows down home construction too, because of the fact that it's harder to find the land and get those deals done. All this is to say that, issues related to lumber and steel, starting, already kind of starting now, those prices are coming down, and that's going to make things easier. But in the long run, it's going to be really hard for the home building industry to be constructing homes at the price points and the pace that we need to meet all the demand that's out there in the market.
Yeah. Last question. You got me thinking, got the wheels spinning in the brain, Jacob. Let me ask you about, you talked through a lot of the issues with steel, with lumber. What about, one of the things we cover on this show and on the network is sustainability, ESG, governance. What about composite materials, a little bit more environmentally friendly materials? Could those be used in substitute for example, lumber to construct a more eco-friendly home? And would those be at a cost similar or below what you're paying for lumber? Does that make sense?
Totally. It totally makes sense. And it's great that you asked that because, the U.S. is kind of weird in the way we build homes. If you go to Europe, for instance, they do a lot of prefabricated housing where homes are literally built in factories and then shipped to, the land that they will be on and then kind of assembled there. So like the pieces of the home, it's modular design. So like they'll build rooms basically or structures in a factory and then they're assembled on site. America is unusual in that we primarily use wood to frame houses. That's not something that you see in other countries to the same extent. And that we do almost all site-built housing. There are obviously, prefabricated homes in certain communities across the country. But when you start talking about, different types of building materials and things like that, that too gets back to zoning. I mean, there are zoning ordinances, building codes that construction companies have to meet with homes. And so, to some extent they can, probably do certain things like, a steel-framed home instead of a lumber-framed home. I don't know if that would save money, or they could use composite materials like you said. And there's certainly movements to update building codes to make those easier to use and, green the industry. But the problem with all this is, you again need building codes and zoning regulations to be updated. There is an extent to which it might be more affordable and more environmentally friendly to do more modular homes and more, prefabricated housing that, is built in a factory. There are some companies that are starting to experiment with 3D printed homes, where they, basically are pouring, concrete with a 3D printer, and that is creating the structure of the home, and then you add the finishes onto that. But with all these developments, which could be really great for the environment, cheaper for consumers, perhaps more sustainable, more long-lasting, it ultimately, again, comes down to the building codes. And for those processes to become more commonplace, we would need to see more communities across the country adopt them. In other countries, they have a universal building code for the whole country, where I don't know if this is true in Germany, but I'm going to use Germany as an example of this hypothetical where, if there's a unified building code in Germany, whether you're building a home in Munich or in Hamburg, you're going to build to the same specifications. In the U.S., it's town by town, county by county, state by state. There's not really a federal rule for these things, and that makes it more difficult for also those industries to develop, to create those materials and create those processes that are better for the environment. Yeah. So I in certain parts of the country, it's definitely happening, and I think there is a lot of groundswell towards that becoming more commonplace. But that, again, everything moves slowly in real estate, is basically what I've learned.
Yeah, and not only in real estate, but in a lot of industries. Well, Jacob, really great chatting with you. Really interesting to kind of. Thanks a lot for breaking down the CPI and the, and the relationship to housing. I thought that was interesting, and we were able to kind of sidestep and go into a different topic, especially sustainability, which is really important to a lot of the minds to some of the audience. Have a great rest of the weekend, and we'll talk to you again very soon.
Talk soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Welcome back. Now time to take a look at what may or may not be going on Capitol Hill and things that fiduciaries, plan sponsors, and participants seem to be thinking about when they think about retirement. Joining us on the line, they are better known as the Legal Eagles, but they're also known as David Levine, Kevin Walsh, and both are principals with Groom Law Group, an employee benefits law firm based in Washington, D.C. Gentlemen, how are you today?
We are great, Jeff. It's good to be at Grom or Groom Law Group. and this week we fully intend as our first priority to talk about the Jeff Snyder retirement bill. Alas, there is none, though, because there's so many pieces. It's been squeezed out. I don't know what to say.
Yeah, no one has consulted me on the piece of legislation that I think makes sense.
Actually, to be honest, I think you'd probably have some great ideas.
Oh,
so you talk to so many people, I'm sure you'd have some really good ideas. But I don't think we're talking legislation this week, are we, Jeff?
No, we're not. I know you guys each have some things that you wanted to bring to the fore. Kevin, let's bring Kevin Walsh in first. Kevin, you're out there talking to clients, maybe virtually still, maybe not physically. But what's top of mind this week as you're, contemplating retirement? Not your own, but retirement in general.
Well, top of mind this week, I mean, at this point it's gelato, because when I hear Grom, I think gelato. There's a fantastic gelateria named Grom, and I think their logo actually looks pretty similar to ours. So far this episode is making me hungry. But okay. The other thing that's on my mind this week is, the Department of Labor and kind of talk about changes to prohibited transaction exemptions. So for people who don't remember, ERISA basically says you can't do anything. That's the shorthand. Every transaction or most transactions are seemingly prohibited. But they say, well,
Kevin, are you going to say ERISA is a backwards law? Are you going to take my line?
ERISA is a backwards law.
Oy vey.
So the idea then is that there are exemptions. So it says, if you do X, Y, and Z, then despite the default being you can't do anything, you can still do things. And there's a number of exemptions we're really watching carefully to see if there are changes to them. But this week, the Department of Labor sent over to the Office of Management and Budget at least a pre-proposal notice saying that they are considering making changes to a number of existing exemptions to get rid of references to credit rating agencies. And this really goes back to Dodd-Frank. So way back when, in 2009, 2010, there was a sense that the financial services industry or investors in general were too reliant on credit rating agencies saying it's safe to do X or it's unsafe to do Y. And so back then, Congress told DOL, we'd like you to update your exemptions so that they're less reliant on the credit rating agencies. And now here we are in 2021, and they have signaled that, we are getting around to it now. So we expect, the next month or two, we'll see those proposals. This Department of Labor is very active, so I wouldn't be surprised if we saw, additional regulatory initiatives from them. But it looks like the next one on the retirement side is going to be, removing these references to credit rating agencies in a handful of existing exemptions.
Okay, and you mentioned has to go through the regulatory process. I'm assuming that there's a comment period where they're going to have to receive feedback from everybody and their mother with inside and outside the industry.
Yeah, so I think we'd expect to see a comment period. So first we have to have it released. So right now it's being reviewed internally by the executive branch as a whole. But after that, we would expect there to be a comment period before anything's finalized.
Okay, David, any reaction to that? And what are you contemplating, like the Department of Labor?
Sure. No, I don't have anything more to add on that. I know this week isn't our exciting week of legislation. It's kind of like, I'll call it the operational world of benefits.
I think this is an exciting week, David.
Yeah,
I wouldn't say it's not an exciting week.
I
mean, it's exciting. We know DOL sends stuff to the executive branch to look at. I think you're going to talk about some tax issues or plan qualification issues. Not everybody wants to know about legislation that may or may not pass. They want to know, the cold hard facts about what's really going on.
The cold hard fact is that Kevin is 100% right. Here's the deal, Kevin. Yep. We're in the Biden administration. I got to use the right phrasing. Here's the deal. I'm going to talk for like a couple seconds here about something that I think plan sponsors and I know service providers are already focused on. That is, right now, many plan sponsors, actually the majority, except for probably the larger plans or very unique plans, use sort of off-the-shelf, pre-approved plan documents. That's the IRS words for it these days. And we have another year to get this all in line and get everybody on so-called new defined contribution plan documents that were approved by the IRS recently. And that process is rolling forward. So why am I bringing it up now? Well, there's a lot that goes on in this. It's basically, you have to basically transfer everything from an old document to a new one. And you got to make sure that everything is correct. And a lot of service providers do a really good job, but there's no such thing as perfection. And you see, as a plan sponsor, you're going to get a new document that's going to say, click here to DocuSign and say it's okay. It's important for all parties to make sure the document is correct. Service providers, especially given the compression in the industry, they'll say, we'll prepare it, but we don't sign this. You have to tell us that it's okay. So my kind of words of wisdom right now is ask your service provider, where's my Cycle 3, as it's called, 401k document? I'd like to see it and look carefully at it and make sure things line up, especially on the normal trouble spots of things like compensation. Is the compensation definition right? Are there any other tweaks? And sometimes you will see with these new documents changes to your service agreements. Your service agreements are an important part of what you do because it says what you as an employer or a fiduciary own and what your service providers do. And there's lots of little tweaks popping up, and sometimes they're very simple, straightforward. Sometimes they relate to a whole bunch of stuff that's not even part of Cycle 3. You could see things about cybersecurity, data usage, privacy, a bunch of the topics we've talked about before. So take a look at these. Some of them are very quick and easy. Some of them really merit some more attention. So for right now, everybody should be starting to think about that because the next 6 to 9 months is a really good time to get ahead on this so that you're not crunched at the end. Because heaven forbid something isn't the way it's supposed to be, it's hard to get it done when you got a deadline staring you straight in the face. So that's my words of wisdom. If wisdom,
so David,
for this week. Yes,
so David,
Kevin Walsh.
David, your wisdom, it's before you DocuSign something, you should make sure it's right. I don't know if I'd be able to surf the internet or use any software if I followed that ad.
Well, Kevin, as I say behind your back and to your face, I fully expect that if there is an option out there for you to be served up more advertising, more information, and give your data away, I expect that you will just say yes without reading it, because I know that's your bias.
David, real quick on this, just to be clear on the deadlines. You've got these, they're called document restatements, right? That's basically what we're talking about here.
Yes.
Where you've got to update them. You mentioned cycle 3. What are our hard deadlines for those plan sponsors out there, employers listening to this show? Hopefully a lot of them, by the way.
Well, that's a really good question, Jeff, and I should know this right off the top. But I started talking without thinking, well, I should recheck, because, the lawyer who says, I remember the deadline, inevitably gets it wrong. I thought it's June of next year, but I could be mistaken. I'll make a deal. Next week, I'll quickly double check and reset it. I should know it off the top, but I'm always paranoid that I'm saying it wrong.
Okay, well, my apologies for putting you on the spot. That wasn't my intent.
No, I deserve it anyway. It's fine. I should know it off the top.
Next
gentlemen,
week's episode, all about deadlines.
All about deadlines. Well, gentlemen, we're going to leave it there. Really appreciate you. Look, this is nuts and bolts. It's granularity, but it's important. This is how retirement plans and benefit plans run. We're going to leave it there. Gentlemen, enjoy the rest of your weekend. Have a great day. We'll talk to you very soon.
Thank you, Jeff.
And that wraps up this episode of BRN Sunday. Have a topic of interest, someone you think we should be talking to, drop us a line. And don't forget, for all the information in retirement markets, technology, personal finance, so much more, check out today's edition of our daily newsletter, The Morning Pulse. We're back again tomorrow for BRN AM. We'll have a very special guest as we talk about some of the key issues of the day. Until then, I'm Jeff Snyder. Stay safe, keep on saving, and don't forget, roll with the changes.